Now, did you notice in this story that there was a crowd? Did you notice that? The crowd was kind of an essential element, a crowd of people. Here we are, chapter 5. The next chapter is chapter 6. And the one after that is chapter 7. Now, this is, in other words, this is close proximity. Go to chapter 7 just for a moment. I'm just pointing out to you, this is likely in chapter 7, not long after what happened in chapter 5. Now remember what happened in chapter 5. The Pharisees were all gathered around, and there was a crowd of people, probably more than just a Pharisee. A crowd of people gathered around, and this remarkable thing happened, and Jesus' message was, your sins are forgiven. And the Pharisees got into a fuss with him about it, and he said, I've got the right. I can pronounce this. I can say sins are forgiven, and just to prove it to you, the man rose up and walked, got everybody's attention. Here we are in chapter 7. Look at verse 36 is where I want to start reading. Again, not long after what just happened. One of the Pharisees desired him, Jesus, that he would eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Verse 37. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner. And I'll just, this is polite King James language, and just use it, leave it to your imagination to understand what it is that they're saying here. Verse 37, behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spoke within himself. In other words, this is his thoughts, his private thoughts. He spoke within himself, saying, this man, meaning Jesus, if he were a prophet, he would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him. That really got him, didn't it? He didn't like that, the fact that she was touching him. For she is a sinner. Now he says if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what manner of woman this is. Now my question is, this Pharisee, he doesn't claim to be a prophet. How does he know? Just food for thought there. Well, truth is, people like that, they're always looking out the window to see what everybody else is up to. Or on the phone. I better leave that alone. I'm not suggesting anyone here is like that. But it's easy. Anyway, so this man, evidently, he's well aware. He seems to know perfectly well what kind of woman this is. But what gets me, what I noticed, first of all, is he's upset because she's touching him. The reason he's upset about that is the Pharisees had an idea about holiness that goes like this. I'm holy, and so I can't have anything to do with ordinary people, because if I come in contact with people who are sinners or less holy than me, it's going to defile me and spoil my holiness. But you see, Jesus didn't have the idea that everybody else is unholy or less holy than him, and if they touched him, they would be defiled. He seemed to have the idea that what was in him could fix what was wrong with them. So he didn't mind that they were touching him. It's sort of like in my work, when I get my hands all dirty at work, and I come in to wash my hands, and that water's rushing out of the faucet, I don't ever think when I put my dirty hands under the faucet that the dirt on my hands is going to run up and pollute the water supply in Alva. It's the other way around. The water that's coming out of that faucet is going to clean my hands. Jesus evidently had the idea that not that he's going to get defiled because a sinner touched him, but what's in him is going to cleanse the sinner. So what's in him is going to help the person that's touching him. Did you know the same thing is true of all of us? We've got something in us as Christians that other people need. Okay, so she's touching him. The Pharisee didn't like it. This woman of the town that's a sinner. And he's saying this within himself. But Jesus, he's pretty smart. He's pretty astute. And he knew, evidently, what this Pharisee was thinking. So he said, verse 40, Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, that's the Pharisee there, I have something to say to you. Oh, sure. Okay, Master, say on. Verse 41. So he has a little story to tell him. Now follow this little story and see if you can understand what he's saying. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. The one owed him 500 pence, the other 50. Now stop right there. Do you get what Jesus is saying? He's saying a creditor had two debtors. One owed him a lot and one didn't owe him very much. The creditor is God, and the debtors are the Pharisee and that woman. And he's saying God is like the creditor, and you are like the person who thinks you don't owe very much, and she's like a person who's done a lot of things wrong, thinks she has a huge debt. But notice verse 42, what he says next. Listen to this. When they, meaning both of them, when they had nothing to pay. Let's stop right there. What Jesus is saying here is some might have done more things wrong than others, and some might be, from human point of view, worse than others, but nobody can pay. Now you might be the you might be more holy than me, and you might be more righteous than me, but you can't pay either. And I might have a lot of things wrong, and somebody else might have there might be a whole scale of things that people have done wrong. The worst to the people who are, better than them. But nobody can pay what they owe. That's what he says here. They had nothing to pay. Well, what does the one to whom the debt is owed, how does he react to that? When they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Frankly there means freely. He's saying this about God. He freely forgave them both. He just did. They couldn't pay, so he just freely forgave them. Did you know that's God's attitude about it? Did we see that in Psalm 103? Forget not his benefits. He forgives all thine iniquity. As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Again, let me remind you, what are we supposed to do with this information? What he would like for us to do is believe in it. Believe it's true for me. This is true for me. I can't pay. But anyway, when they had nothing to pay, either one of them, he freely forgave them both. I think that's a pretty good idea. I think that's a good thought, don't you? Do you suppose that that's something that people need to know? I find that people in the church need to know it. Sometimes I think people sitting in the church pews need to know it more than people out here. Sometimes it's people in church who are the most burdened with guilt, because at least, we have a more sensitive conscience perhaps, and more sensitive about things. This is a good message. It's not just for sinners, it's for church people as well. It's for everybody. He's freely forgiven everyone. He freely, frankly forgave them both. But listen to what Jesus said. Tell me therefore, which of them will love him the most? Oh, that's a good thought. One owed him a lot, one owed him not very much. And he freely forgave them both. So Jesus said, tell me now, which one loves him the most? And Simon answered and said, I suppose he to whom he forgave the most. And he said unto him, thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, do you see this woman? I entered thine house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say to you, her sins which are many are forgiven. Now, I want you to notice that he is not here saying, I now choose to forgive her sins. He's just saying they are. For she loved much. What he's saying is she is demonstrating by the way she's acting that she believes her sins, her many sins are forgiven. He says, because she's showing this kind of love to me, she believes that her sins are forgiven. Now, I want to ask you a question. Where did she get this idea? Where did she get the notion that her sins might be forgiven? She evidently believes they are. Jesus said that's why she's acting like this. You know what I think? I think she was in that crowd back there in chapter 5. I think she heard Jesus say to that man coming down out of the roof, your sins are forgiven. And I think she thought to herself, well, if his sins are forgiven, maybe mine are too. And I think as she thought about that, in between chapter 6 and 7, she got the idea, wow, this Jesus, He's giving away forgiveness of sins. And he said to this man, your sins are forgiven. And she started believing her sins were forgiven because look at how she's acting. He said, the one who's forgiven the most loves the most. And she is demonstrating the way she, by her actions, what she believes. Her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said to her, just so the point is clear, thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, who is this that forgives sins also? Did you notice every time this happens, they get upset? Isn't that strange? See, if it were me, I'd think, wow, isn't that precious? Isn't that sweet? Isn't that wonderful? That's great. See, I would think to myself, wow, I got to change my theology. This is a pretty good message here. Except that when you adopt that attitude, you get the same kind of criticism. Oh, listen, let me tell you, I've got calls on the phone from people upset. Anytime I'm almost afraid to go out of this church and speak, and I get asked to speak at Thanksgiving services and, and Easter services and things. And listen, I don't waste any opportunities. I have this same message there. I found out not everybody thinks it's a good message. Whew, brother. Who is this that forgives? Well, you know what and this is true. What upsets people is when you give it away for free. And, well, what does one man say? Well, in our church, we say, well, you can say that in your church, it's a free country, but I don't want to put any obstacles in anybody's way. I don't want to charge for what God's given away for free. Make anybody do anything to get it. I just say he's given it away for free. Just take it. Forget not his benefits. Oh, let's see now. Who is this that forgives sins also? Jesus just ignored all of them. He said to the woman, notice this is the only one he's paying any attention to here. He said to the woman, thy faith hath saved thee. Well, what kind of faith is that? Faith in who, I wonder? A faith in him and what it is he's saying and what it is he's doing. Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. I think that's a pretty good thought, don't you? Well, last week I noticed, I always know when I get home and start editing the videotape how long it was. I know I went really long last week, so today I'm going to try to go a little shorter. Let's all stand up today. Jesus!